when you have choice, other people are more likely to view you as a rational actor, you're likely to view yourself as one, and you are more likely to take steps to improve yourself. I think that's probably pretty good. 3 things in the speech. First, some setup, then why this deters or, in the worst case, appropriately shames bad sexual preferences, then why this is better for you if you have good sexual preferences. First, some setup. I think this is pretty simple. I think just to explain how both of these narratives are propagated, because I think they're probably propagated in pretty similar contexts. I think these are both pretty widespread narratives. They're done through things like your friends and family, through social movements, or through media. Note that we'll talk about who it targets specifically in the rest of this speech, but I think this is pretty widespread. It doesn't just occur in, for instance, Western countries or developing countries. I think it happens across the world. Cool. First thing to explain is how this deters or appropriately shames bad sexual preferences. The first thing I'm going to do is explain actually what a bad sexual preference looks like. And no, I'm not going to run the homophobic argument because that's not a good idea. First, I think this looks like liking touching kids or, animals, so being a pedophile or bestiality. Second, this looks like doing deeply oppressive things, for instance, having domination kicks where you like to oppress or choke women. Or thirdly, doing things like having dangerous sex, which is encouraged by stuff like porn addictions or doing things which put other people's lives in danger. The second thing to explain then is why this narrative asymmetrically applies to these preferences. There are 3 reasons for this. Firstly, these are the sexual preferences most likely to be questioned in popular discourse for the simple reason that that they're just really sus. Like, the vast majority of people do not have sexual preferences. That means they like to fuck animals. So, if you do, you're most likely to be questioned or interrogated about it, which means narratives of why you have those sexual preferences are most likely to apply to you. Are they a choice? Are they something that's genetically wired into you? But second, I think this is the most potent version of this narrative because you have the highest potential to be absolved of blame and potentially get the highest benefit. Because the average person in society probably thinks that having sex with children is a bad thing, but if you have the potential benefit from this narrative by being like, oh, it's not my fault, then you're the most likely to be incented to use it. But thirdly, you're most likely to be affected by this narrative because you're, for instance, the most likely to be encouraged to change. People are most likely to view your behaviors as bad and therefore try and use this narrative on you. All right. The next thing to explain then is why it is possible to change, and this narrative specifically facilitates it, and that's for 4 reasons. First, I think a lot of people's sexual preferences are just shaped by their behavior. For instance, men when they are young often absorb violent or hysterical notions of sex through things like porn consumption and think that it is good for them to dominate women in demeaning ways. So I think that your behaviors, for instance, the amount of porn you consume can just change. So if you were told that you ought not be, someone who shames women, then you can just stop consuming porn so you can change your behavior. But second, it is so totally possible to rewire your brain. You can just go to therapy. You can just learn that your sexual preferences are bad. And I would note that even if we do not change your preferences entirely, you can get told that maybe you should stop acting on your preferences, and that is probably a good thing. For instance, pedophiles can get told that what they are doing is fucking wrong and not just genetically wired into them, and therefore they should act on touching kids less. But thirdly, I think even if you do believe that we end up shaming these people, that is fine, because then they are less likely to act on their behaviors, and that is the worst form of harm. Like when people feel shamed about the fact that they like fucking animals or children, they are less likely to do that act, and that is an irreversible and huge harm in this debate. But fourthly, even if you do not believe that we affect individuals' capacity to change, I think a narrative which says that people have choice over the way they select their sexuality is more likely to lead to research, because it's more likely to look at the conditions which cause people to create these sexualities. The thing I would note is that a norm that says that something is a choice means you are unlikely to get away with something as easily. You are unlikely to be like, well, I'm just genetically hardwired into this. You can't oppress me on the basis of something that I am and cannot change. That's unfair to me. That's mean. If people view something as a choice, they're more likely to be able to tell you that it is wrong, that you ought to change it, and try and affect your behaviors. And I think even the smallest chance at that happening is hugely important in this debate, because this narrative mostly applies to terrible sexual preferences, and where those get acted upon, the harms are irreversible, the harms are terrible. This looks like people scarring children for life, sexually assaulting women. Those are the most important contexts in this debate, and you obviously ought care about those. I'll take a point of information from closing.
Yeah, so your claim is that when sins are choices, people get more blame for it. Would you want gay people to be punished equivalently to pedophiles?
I'm going to explain in this next argument, first, why this narrative provides a benefit to gay people. Second, why if it does shame gay people, that is probably symmetric in a variety of instances. But thirdly, actually your narrative causes worse forms of shame for gay people, for instance, in contexts like conversion therapy. Cool. So the next argument simply explains why if you have good sexual preferences, like, I don't know, being gay and not being a pedophile, that this narrative is probably good for you. That is for 3 reasons. The first set of reasons is to explain that this narrative is internally affirming for people who are gay. So, or, you know, who have good sexual preferences. And that is for 3 reasons. The first thing is that this narrative assumes that you have choice over who you are and your sexuality, and you are a rational actor. Like, if you are just hardwired into something, I think that assumes that you can't do things like, you know, explore who you are in more meaningful ways, or you can't do things like actually be able to make a cognizant decision about the actions you make. It assumes you don't have agency and the degree of rationality that our side explains. And I think saying that you have that is often quite internally affirming for people. And I would note that that's really important, because the vast majority of narratives primarily occur inside people's heads, and the context in which you are able to justify yourself and have agency is the most crystallized benefit in this debate. But second, I think this facilitates experimentation, because you believe that you can do things and those have results, rather than you are straying from your essential nature that has been determined for you. But thirdly, I think this also probably just leads to a higher degree of information around things like sexuality. For instance, people look at the different choices people make and why they make them, rather than saying like, oh, this set of people are hardwired in this way. I think there's probably likely to be more information about how you can choose different parts of your sexuality or take actions to explore that. And that means higher education means people feel more internally affirmed and are more able to explore themselves. This is really important, because any claims about, you know, the way people treat gay people are much less direct to this narrative and much less certain, because they require a bunch of proof. This is an internally affirming thing. That is more important. Second thing is that this is just good for social movements. Firstly, because it's a kind of messaging that encourages people to do stuff. Like, if you have something is a choice, that implies that you ought to take action to do it, and it's commonly used by social movements to imply you ought to take action. But second, it gives more grounds for improvement and valid critique. Like, the feminist movement is now able to critique feminists who are like, well, I just like being housewives and being dominated by my husband and choked by my husband, because that is part of the patriarchy, but you are now able to critique it because it's an invalid choice. But thirdly, it increases intersectionality and palatability. The last thing I'm going to do is flip conversion therapy. I think conversion therapy or bad treatment of gay people is often irrational and unrelated to this narrative. It comes from a belief that gay people are bad rather than they choose it or that it's inherent to them. That is extraneous to this narrative. But also, we can flip this, because the worst kinds of conversion therapy happen when you think it is not a choice. You're more likely to, I don't know, get exercised, get tortured, and that is terrible.
To Lady Gaga, but Born This Way is a fucking depressing case for gay inclusion. Well, you can't get rid of us, so you better just give up persecuting us. Doesn't work and is miserable. Being gay is fine and good, actually, and if more people choose to be gay, more power to them. By the way, if you're bisexual, you literally can choose, and you know, it's fine if you choose to be in a gay relationship. This opposition bench, I think, is just defending something profoundly hopeless. People with horrifying and shameful sexual preferences that make their life worse and make other people's lives worse should have, you know, just have no hope of changing them. I think that is a terrible thing to tell people. We would want to give people as much agency as possible. I'll start with good or harmless sexual preferences, dealing with the gay people push we seem to be getting from the opposition bench, and then I'll talk in the second half of my speech about bad and harmful sexual preferences. On good or harmless preferences, I think the push of this team is really to be like, well, you know, where you conceive of gay people as being able to change their preference, you're more likely to do things like conversion therapy. You're more likely to force them to change their preference. There's a series of problems with this argument. The first thing I would note is just that the disgust that people feel towards gay people is exogenous to this debate. And I think a really easy way of illustrating this is just lots of Christians do not believe that you choose to be gay. They do think it's something inherent to you. They just think it is something sinful that you have been born with. And people believe people have been born with sinful personalities in lots of other ways too. For instance, if you're like a natural liar or you're a mean person, you've been born in a sinful way, still disapprove of it and think you shouldn't act on it, which is why narratives like, well, you can be gay, you just can't act on it, you know, love the sin, hate sin, that kind of thing, is very common. It is just so unclear to me that people's opposition towards being gay is particularly closely linked to with the extent to which they believe it is a choice. But secondly, as we observe in a point of information, believing that something that you view as sinful and shameful is inherent about people is extremely dangerous, both internally, because as Isobel explains to No Response, now you believe internally that there is something shameful about yourself that you cannot change, that is inherent, that you were born in a kind of cursed and terrible way. I think that's a really bad way to think about yourself, but it is also bad society-wide because you're much more likely to, for instance, just do exorcisms to people. I know that sounds crazy, but like I literally know someone who that happened to. Like that is the thing that like crazy Christians like still do. You're much more likely to do things like honor killings because you just don't believe that that person can be redeemed. You don't believe that they can change. And it's like in the context where this team for some reason wants to situate this debate, highly conservative communities that are always going to hate gay people, it is so unclear to me why it is preferable for them to believe not just that like, to believe that this is something that is totally unchangeable and you're just stuck with. I find it honestly a little baffling. But thirdly, I would just note that there are obviously other ways to address conversion therapy. Conversion therapy is likely to go away on either side of the debate. For example, the belief that being gay is okay is spreading. Like people are becoming less homophobic. You can, just do that narrative, which makes people less want to do conversion therapy in the first place. And also, you can just point out that conversion therapy is extremely cruel and entails doing a lot of unkind things to people. So regardless of what you believe about the underlying characteristic of being gay, you ought not do it. Fourthly, I would note that this debate is actually not about sexuality, it is about sexual preferences, and there are a lot of sexual preferences that you do choose. For instance, being promiscuous, having sex with lots of people, or being polyamorous or something like that, is a choice. It's something, maybe you have an inclination towards it that you're born with, but acting on it is certainly a choice. And I think it's actually pretty important that those sorts of choices are not persecuted and stigmatized by religion. The rest of the things that OO says on this issue, I think, is basically like, well, this narrative is true. There are like gay seagulls, and that means, we're kind of, like, it is just true that people are born this way. A few problems with this. Firstly, as I observe preferences are different to sexuality, I think there are a lot of preferences which people clearly create through things like media consumption. I find it implausible that people emerge from the womb like wanting to be vacuum sealed. I think obviously it is just the case that some things, you condition yourself, right? Like, obviously. Secondly, though, I would just note that just because you're born in a particular way doesn't mean you can't change it. It could be true that pedophiles are born with an inclination towards pedophilia. It could also be true that therapy can help them move away from that. So I don't think this is responsive to us. The other thing they say is, well, maybe you can have the narrative that maybe you get rid of the narrative that queer people are like influencing or persuading children to become queer. I don't think this works because obviously the narrative that being queer is out of your control actually, I think, legitimizes and emboldens this kind of narrative. It's like the reason why so many people are becoming queer out of their control is because of a decadent, liberal society that is giving people, that is making people crazy, or like maybe there's just like chemtrails or something. Who knows? Unclear that it works in particularly progressive ways. So I think that defeats basically all of their stuff about being nice to people that's gay. I think it's probably symmetrical, but even if it, but I think it's actually probably better on our side to the extent that we at least persuade people that it's not inherent. I'll take a point from closing.
Yeah, people don't like lies because they hurt people. People don't like pedophiles because they hurt children. Being gay doesn't really hurt anyone. The problem is no one gets to that point where they question it because they just think it's a choice you can just opt out.
What? Like, no, people don't like gay people because the Bible says it isn't, because they're conditioned from like centuries of homophobia, because there's a bunch of terrible narratives from the AIDS epidemic. Like, people have reasons in their head why they hate gay people. It isn't something that they like woke up and decided like totally irrationally to believe. Those things can be challenged. You can persuade people to be less homophobic. That literally has happened in society. And telling people it's a choice wouldn't change people's assessment of whether it's good or bad. Like, many choices are bad. Why is telling this is a choice? Why would that change how homophobic people are? That makes no fucking sense. All right, I want to flip this. This leads to more sexual pluralism on our side of the debate. I think a choice framing leads to a lot more discourse about which choices are legitimate. I think it means that we can unpack why we oppose or prefer particular preferences. I think most people are pretty liberal in society, like people like having agency themselves, which means I think that this is something which leads to more sexual freedom and sexual education in the long run, as Isobel explains to her response. Finally, on bad and harmful sexual preferences, I think I've already explained to some extent why it is possible to change these things. They're often shaped via porn and media. They come from negative attitudes like racism or sexism. They come from personal traumas sometimes that you can address via therapy. But also, I just know that therapy can change lots of things about people. Things like addiction, things like OCD compulsions, you can overcome, which suggests that people have a pretty high capacity to rewire their brain. Secondly, I would note that this narrative helps people to change. It provides them with the impetus to do so because they believe it is possible. It means that they are more likely to admit uncomfortable things about themselves they need to change, because if there's no hope of changing, why would you ever admit it to yourself? Thirdly, it means there is socially more research and resources put towards helping people rewire their preferences. But finally, I would note that broader social critique, like the feminist movement pointing out that things like auto-asphyxiation can be very, very dangerous, makes people realize that their preferences are problematic in the first instance. The benefits of this are just massive. We prevent people from deeply destructive sexual preferences that traumatize other people and that are dangerous, but also it is really good for these people. They are freed from a terrible thing that makes their life deeply stigmatizing, that makes them feel a deep sense of shame, that makes them hurt other people. Even if people can't always change those preferences, it's certainly worth trying.
If you were told to be gay is an immoral choice, if you were told that every time you look at a woman on the street or hold hands, you are making an immoral choice and you are doing a sin, inside government's world, you feel like you're immoral every day. You feel like you're a bad person every day. You feel like you are sinning every day when you keep on making this choice and you just can't stop. That is a world in which people feel far more guilty. That is a world in which people feel far more shame. That is obviously not a preferable world. Firstly, on who does this narrative apply to? Secondly, on how people feel about themselves. Thirdly, on how people feel about others. Firstly, who does this narrative apply to? Opening government wants it to apply to people who have bad sexual preferences, like people who are pedophiles or people who, I guess, do like bad forms of BDSM. Firstly, on pedophiles and bestiality. These things are shamed regardless for three pretty intuitive reasons. Firstly, it's universally hated, and the reason for this is that it's non-consensual, which is obviously not true of queer people, which means that you're firstly doing something that's obviously causing a lot of harm and is really bad, but secondly, and most importantly, you're doing a crime, which is a far stronger deterrent than a social narrative, which means that if people are willing to do things like pedophilia, even though they're risking years of jail time, it's incredibly unlikely that a narrative that tells them they're making a choice is going to be the thing that changes their mind. But secondly, and most importantly, people hide these behaviours. So that means that no one can impose shame on you, because when you're a pedophile, you keep that secret because that's something that's deeply like a crime, so you have to keep it secret, which means that you don't feel shame about yourself because you weren't willing to overcome that criminal deterrent. But secondly, other people can't make you feel shame because they don't even know that you're doing it in the first place. That means on those worst examples that it's just no change. On their more charitable example of men being too domineering and too violent in sex, the problem is that people do this regardless, because you don't do this because you believe that this is something innate to you, that it's part of your identity that you must be violent in sex. You do this because of all the reasons they say. It's because you've watched porn. It's because you've been raised in a world in which you believe that is normal and that is acceptable sex. So that means the narrative doesn't work, because you don't realize there's an alternative. You don't realize you're choosing to do something that is more violent or more controlling than usual. You just think that's what everyone does because that's all you've seen. Like that's all you've seen in the porn. So that means that you just believe that is what sex is like. But secondly, it's because this isn't something that's binary. It's not like you choose to do BDSM or not do BDSM. It's something that exists on a spectrum from like, I guess, maybe what we would see as more like normal sex, not to discriminate, but more normal sex on the spectrum to kind of more controlling sex, which means that it's not something that you're kind of choosing to do or not do. It's just probably how you see sex as normal. It is just how you do your normal sex, which means it's not a distinct choice that you're making or a distinct identity that you have, so the narrative probably doesn't arise here. Comparatively, the narrative does apply to queer people for two reasons. Firstly, because being queer is an obvious but importantly public choice. When you are queer, you walk down the street with your partner, you introduce your partner to all your friends and family, you post them on social media, so people know you're queer, which means they can apply that external shame to you far more strongly than they can with something that stays within the bedroom. But secondly, it's because this is far more widespread discrimination. It is unfortunately untrue that discrimination against queer people is reducing, so that means you actually are faced against a lot of social pressure for this, which means that this debate is in fact mostly about queer people. So let's talk about queer people then. Firstly, about how they feel about themselves. But first I'll take a point from closing if there is one.
So who do you think created the narrative that sexuality is a choice?
Cool. As we explained at Anhaar, I think this is created by the queer community. This is about how the queer community markets themselves to the world. They say that we were born this way, therefore we can't change and you shouldn't do conversion therapy. No, thank you. Obviously, it might be co-opted by others. Sure, you can prove that at closing if you want, but this is where it originated. First thing then, why queer people feel better about themselves. We went here because queer people feel huge amounts of shame in government's world. For all the reasons that opening government says, this is a ridiculous psychological toll. It means you feel like you are doing a sin and doing something immoral every day of your life, every time you sleep with your partner. That is a terribly, terribly awful. What do they say? They say this is internally affirming and it gives you agency. But firstly, I would flip this because you can't actualize that agency, because as we explained at Anhaar, this isn't something that is a choice, which means you feel like you should be able to make a choice, but you can't, which makes you in fact feel far worse about yourself and far more constrained. But secondly, I flip this because you're more likely to experiment and discover in a world in which you want to find yourself because you believe this is identity, and one in which you believe it's a continuous choice. But lastly, I want to flip them on bi people, because I think this world is actually far better for bi people. New mechanism here, because the problem is that being bi isn't a choice. Like each individual your relationship is a choice. You're not choosing on the whole to like be bi. You can't change that you're attracted to both men and women. And the problem is that often the queer movement, because of internalized biphobia, forces you to pick one because you're seen as betraying women when you date men, because you've chosen to date a man when you could have chosen to date a women. But this narrative would say that actually you can't choose to be bi. You do just have preferences to both. You are just attracted to both men and women, and therefore that means that less biphobia happens. What are the responses they give to our claim here? First, they say, I think perhaps the best response could be that, well, if you feel like you can't change it, then you just feel guilty forever and you're never going to be able to accept yourself. Even if this is the case, I think this is better because it's kind of one thing that's wrong, rather than on their side you're making a constant wrong decision and a constant sin, which means you feel far worse about yourself. But no, but secondly, and most importantly, I think you are far more likely to reach acceptance on our side for 3 reasons. Firstly, because counter-narratives exist that tell you to be yourself. These narratives are kind of like general ones that are promoted like literally from primary school of like, you should be yourself, you shouldn't let people change you, like dress how you want, wear what you want. And that narrative is something that people can apply to themselves and think, well, if this is just who I am, then I should just be who I am and I should just accept myself. That's a narrative that appears all like everywhere in media and in movies. But secondly, it's because the queer community, as we explained and set up, is the one promoting this narrative, which means that obviously they do this in a way that's like, embrace yourself, you're amazing, you're lovely, because they obviously have, like want people to feel accepted in themselves, which means that you probably engage with this narrative through the queer community, so you are able to reach acceptance with yourself. So that explains to you that people feel far less shame and far more acceptance, which is just debate winning opening opposition, and there just was not sufficient responses from government bench. No. Second question then, how does this shape how people interact with queer people and how they see queer people? First thing here is to explain that we get, so we win here because we get less religious discrimination, less conversion therapy, people are more accepted generally. The problem for opening government is their first argument proves this claim, because all that impacting they give at the end of deputy, when they say more resources go towards things when you think it's a choice, people will try to change themselves more when they think it's a choice, like people will like put more pressure on others when they think it's a choice. All of that just works for our argument, because I've explained to you that first question, this narrative does apply more to queer people, which explains why more resources go towards homophobic groups, more resources go towards transphobic groups, and more queer people feel as though they can change themselves, more parents feel as though they can change their kids, and it's therefore that their child has chosen to be queer. So all that should mean, you should just believe before I even explain anything more that we have just won this claim, and there is more homophobia in our world. But what are the responses they give to us? They say, well, conversion is extraneous because religions just believe that queer people are bad and that's never going to change. I think then I'm going to prove why religions are more likely to change their view of queer people in our world. That is because most sins that exist in religions are things that are choices and actions. Because the reason that religions kind of developed these things was to encourage people to be more moral, which means you see things as like, I guess, hurting people or killing people. That's a bad choice that someone's made, so therefore that's a sin. That means that if you believe that being queer is a choice, that means religion is far more discriminatory towards queer people, because you believe they are choosing to sin every day when they could choose otherwise. Comparatively, if you believe they could not choose otherwise, you're likely to be more accepting and realize that that is just the way they are. But even if we can't change the minds of religions, still better in our world, they're still less violent. Because the comparative they say is, well, they'll do worse conversion therapy, they'll do exorcisms. But I think the comparative is maybe just in the most generous welcome government. I think the comparative is just that the church abandons you. They say, well, we can't change you, that's fine, and they just leave you. That is far better for 3 reasons. Firstly, it means you can escape a context that believes you are an immoral person much faster. It means you can leave the church behind and move on with your life. Secondly, it means you face less pressure to change from your parents because they believe that you're, I guess, a lost cause, but at least they're not going to try and force you to change something that you cannot change. But thirdly, I think it just means the church has put less money into conversion therapy because they believe it won't work, but they don't think people can change. I think this creates a huge benefit for queer people in the most problematic context. I think this means people suffer far less harassment and far less pressure. Clearly another debate-winning win for opening opposition.
The timeline of this debate has been unfortunately deeply confused because the original narrative that existed was men and women were created by God to have sex with each other and to reproduce. It was that most marriages had to be consummated. It was the idea that most people existed to have children. This was a narrative that was created by liberal movements to oppose this, to have the idea that sexuality is a choice. Sexuality is not something that you are inherently made to be and made to do in a certain way. It is rather something that was mutable and something controllable by the self. We'll have 2 extensions of this debate. The first would be to explain why the belief that sexual desire is controllable is important in people's relationships. The second would be to explain why reproducing the importance of sexuality is good discursively. Firstly, why the belief in sexual desire is controllable is important. What this argument will explain is that when people believe that sexual desire is innate, it means that people can do bad things. It means that men can feel like they're entitled to have sex with their partner, and it means that people feel guilty when they choose not to have sex with their partner when they otherwise do not want to. The first premise of this argument will be explain why the belief in broader preferences being a choice extends to sexuality as a whole and sexual desires. The first thing to explain is it is built on the same basis, the logic is built on the same basis. That's to say, with sexuality being intrinsic and sexual preferences being intrinsic, this also does say that your broader desires are intrinsic. Your need to have sex, your preference to who to have sex with can't be decoupled by the idea that you want, as a man, you have a biological need to have lots of sex, which explains why generally this argument operates on the same line of logic, which is that when you are predetermined to have sex with a certain person, you're also predetermined to desire and need a certain amount of sex. But secondly, I'd explain that the conclusion of this argument operates the same way. Because that is to say, the conclusion of opposition bench is that if you have an intrinsic preference for something, you ought to permit it. But this also concludes if you have an intrinsic desire for sex, you ought to be entitled to it. Because people believe that that is the way they are made. People believe that is because they are men, they are entitled to sex. And when they believe that that is intrinsic to them, they believe that they have a right to be able to access that preference that they have. But thirdly, I would say that people cognitively generally group these things together. The idea of who you have sex with and what gender it is very hard to decouple from the idea of desiring sex and the amount of sex that you need not being something that is predetermined. Generally, people view sexuality as a whole, and they're likely to either view both things as a choice or both things as predetermined. But finally, I think this narrative does just broadly discount the level of agency that people have in controlling their sexual desires. Because when the narrative is that because you are gay, you have to be allowed to have gay sex, because that's your only means of self-actualization, it's very hard to argue against because you're a man who wants to have sex with women, you ought not be entitled to having sex with women. So that explains why this generally operates in both axes of desire and in preferences there. The second part of this argument then would be explained, why does the belief that sexual desires are innate lead to harms? But before I continue, opening opposition.
Sure, our response to opening government defeats this extension because the narrative applies most strongly to the most distinct and most public sexual preferences, which is queer people, which explains why government bench proves why queer people feel much more shame in your world.
But like why? Because like the intrinsic sexual preferences the vast majority of people have is to have sex with their partner. It is something they believe they're entitled to. It is something that media tells them they're entitled to, that marriages and religious doctrines tell them that they're entitled to. And when you believe that that is something that is immutable and not a choice, that is bad. So why does this belief then lead to harms? The first thing I would say is that this discounts bad behavior, especially by men. Because when your partner consists in constantly asking you for sex, or when your partner pressures you, you believe that that is not a reflection of their character, but rather it's just their desires and their innate sexuality. It is something that they were made to be, which means that you are less likely to leave this relationship because you don't see that pressuring of you having sex with them as a marker of broader character concerns and them broader being a bad person. People often isolate how their partner treats them sexually to how their partner treats them holistically. But often when your partner treats you sexually, that is a bad relationship, that is not good for you. But secondly, this emboldens men to actually pressure women, because the reason that you can play it off as this is actually just something I was biologically made to do. If you look at like all of these like Andrew Tate believers that like men are made to have sex with lots of women, that is a desire that you have, you ought to allow that desire to occur. We think that that desire should be changed and the desire should be something that you should control. But secondly, I think it just creates broadly and plays into narratives of men having a broader entitlement to sex, ideas of religion and marriages needing to be consummated, ideas of the Bible saying you must be fruitful and multiply, and norms to have sex after 3 dates. You believe that these are intrinsic things of how the world operates and things that you need to give into and things that you're entitled to. But secondly, I would say that this pressures women into having sex too, because you believe that it is your duty as someone's girlfriend to have sex with them, because that is how intrinsically you both are, that's intrinsically how your relationship will operate. But thirdly, I would say that it means that support networks generally don't actually call out bad behavior when they see it, because they see it as more normal. They'd be like, yeah, that's just your partner being a guy, boys will be boys, not your partner is actively making a choice to be awful to you, not your partner actively making a choice to assault you when you choose not to have sex. That is something that is regrettable. How should you weigh this argument? I would just say that this prevents a lot of sexual violence, and it means that over time, people get more in control over people, especially calling out intimate partner violence and interpersonal and intermarital rape. Because I would just say that the largest set of these people are people who exist in both gay and straight relationships, and this is something that occurs in all relationships. But also the vast majority of sexual violence is in interpersonal relationships, and that is where the biggest harms are done. When people see it as a choice, people are more likely to know that their partner isn't entitled to it, but it also means that media, social movements are able to put a much stronger narrative that your partner's behavior to you is a choice, it's not something you ought to discount. Your friends are more likely to call it out, and that's important. The second extension will be to explain why reducing the overall importance of sexuality is good. Because I would say that this narrative elevates the importance of sexuality, because it means that your sexuality is now a question of your identity. It is something that's seen as immutable. It is something that means is that you see it as how God has made you. And the reason why this is harmful and new from our opening is threefold. Firstly, it means that it's harder for the individual to go into the process of experimentation. Now, if you want to try like gay sex for the first time, you have to make a whole value statement on who you are as a person, how you are created, and what your intrinsic needs and desires are. That is something that's a lot harder for someone. It's something that's a lot more intimidating for someone, which means that they're less likely to do it and less likely to understand their preferences. But secondly, I would just say that an important concept of context, choosing to live by your sexual preferences would just be bad for you. Let's say if your parents are truly abusive and if you are gay, they will beat you up, in many countries kill you. That is something that you should have a way to reverse out of. And when it is your choice, you uniquely access an ability for people to reverse their decision. They can say, I won't do this anymore, and their parents can believe them. But when it is intrinsic, that is when you feel like you need to change someone. Because shock therapy exists because you want to change someone's neurochemistry. That is the existence of it. And when you believe that it is innate, you're more likely to do that. When you believe it's a choice, people escape much easier. You should oppose their narrative.
Great, thanks for that.
Closing opposition will enter this debate in three ways. Firstly, we'll prove that there is less external shame for queer communities. Secondly, that there is less internal guilt and more acceptance. And thirdly, we'll just weigh our material over Gulf bench. So, firstly, why is there less external shame of queer communities? We will prove two premises here. Firstly, why you are shamed less for immutable or uncontrollable traits than you are for mutable traits. And secondly, why this narrative specifically applies to the good sexualities discussed in the debate rather than the bad ones discussed by OG and then CG. First, on the first premise, so why you are shamed less for immutable or uncontrollable traits than mutable ones. This is important because OO say, well, yeah, you're shamed less for uncontrollable traits, and OG say you value agency. But we'll kind of prove this using 5 reasons. The first reason is I think this specifically applies in the context of love, and I would note that we value love the most that people do not choose to feel. So a mother's innate, attraction to or kind of like caring for their child, rather than, for example, we value it as the highest or most important form of love compared to friendship, which I think is entirely a choice. We think we value that, but I think we value familial or kind of uncontrollable love a bit more. Secondly, I think this applies in what traits we value in others. I would note that we often value authenticity. And the reason for that is because we want to see people's real selves, which implies that actually is a true, immutable, or uncontrollable self. There is something that is something imbued in the soul beyond just kind of your own choices. The fact that we want to, in our relationships, date or be friends with kind people rather than just normal people who choose to be kind. Thirdly, I think this applies in the way that we want certainty in how we view others. We like the idea that people just kind of are how they are rather than changing. It's kind of somewhat uncomfortable, the idea that our enemies, could just become good people, or our friends could turn against us. We would rather view people as kind of good or bad, and this narrative provides predictability. We want to put people in boxes, so we like the idea that people are, so we value this kind of immutable, uncontrollable trait. No thanks, Jehiel. Fourthly, I would note that we assign fault to control. And opening opposition says, well, we don't necessarily assign blame in these instances, but the reason for it is this idea of control. Because the way that we judge the actions of others is we imagine ourselves in their situation and we kind of think about, would we have made a different decision? And the reason that we don't judge kind of uncontrollable traits is that we know that we couldn't have made a different decision. For example, when someone gets into a car accident, and we say, oh, there's nothing more you could have done, we don't judge them. Whereas if they hopped in the car and started drink driving, obviously we assign far more blame to them. So the reason that we assign more fault is because of control. Fifthly and finally, this applies in terms of how we view fate, and opening opposition kind of say, well, this aligns with religious narratives, but really explain it. I think there are two alternatives. People either view fate as arbitrary, or they view it as part of God's plan. If you view fate as arbitrary, I think people broadly understand the lottery of birth. They understand this because of how they perceive the world around them. They've seen that people they know who have grown up rich just get better jobs because they've had a better education. They see people who are just born more attractive, be more successful in dating. Maybe they've resented that, maybe they haven't. But they realise that fate is on some level arbitrary, and they therefore don't assign fault to uncontrollable things. Or they believe that fate is part of God and God's plan, therefore they believe that God is all-knowing, God knows more than them, and God's plan is ultimately good, so therefore they view any uncontrollable thing as good. Therefore, I think this proves why people are shamed less for uncontrollable things than controllable things. Then, why doesn't this apply to kind of violence or the bad preferences discussed by opening government and then closing government? There are 4 reasons for this. Firstly, there are just other narratives that exist. For example, the patriarchy, which would just justify the kind of male entitlement that closing government talks about. The comparative is, this is the reason behind things like homophobia. The second response is that there's a distinction between actions and wants. So even if on Gov Bench you accept that you accept preferences like bestiality or whatever, you don't accept the actions and the actualization of those preferences. Thirdly, I just think that this is wrong for other reasons, like the fact it hurts others, whereas that justification can't be used for things like queerness because it doesn't hurt others. And then fourthly, I think that you can fulfill the preferences they describe in other ways. So you can fulfill, the idea of like pedophilia or bestiality by watching porn as they describe. But you can't fulfill the desire for queerness because that necessarily requires relationships. That requires acceptance. That requires being part of a community. What impacts do we claim? Firstly, we get more buy-in. Our narratives are just more believed. Secondly, it is a better narrative if it is believed. And we don't just claim the impacts like get less gay conversion therapy as opening opposition talks about, but also active protections, things like legislation protecting against people. Before I move on, I'll take OG.
Yeah, it's not just about shame, you also need the impetus and resources to change. Obviously, this narrative applies to what people view as the solution to bad preferences, but also feminist critiques of bad sex are often rebutted with the claim, oh, it's just my inherent preference, as opening government explains.
Yeah, I don't think our narrative is just about shame. I think we prove we have buy-in as well, as you described. Secondly, why do we have less internal guilt and more acceptance? We're going to prove here that the perception of choice is paralyzing and anxiety-inducing rather than empowering and affirming, which is the missing premise in opening government's case. 4 reasons. Firstly, I think people don't have a yardstick to determine whether or not a choice they make is their own choice or something imposed upon them, because obviously all choices you make are a mix of yourself and your environment. You question, did I want to be a lawyer because my parents were lawyers or because I really actually just love law? Secondly, I think people only post-rationalize their choices if it's a decision you can reverse. For example, you tell yourself having children was the right choice for me because you know that you can't reverse that choice. But sexuality is something, the choice to identify in a different sexuality is something you can necessarily reverse. You can't just be like, oh no, I was wrong, I'm not bi. Thirdly, we think that you can tell yourself the grass is always greener. You can prioritize acceptance and avoiding homophobia or expression of yourself, which means that you're constantly anxious and you constantly question. But fourthly, I think there are external pressures that make you anxious because we think the commodification of queerness is more likely when it is viewed as in your control because there are corporate incentives to attract people to fashion, to events as part of that choice, which means that this creates a competition to be the most queer or to be the most you, but you don't know who you are. You don't know what being queer means to you, which means that you don't feel like you're queer enough, you don't feel like you're you enough, and you kind of default. It is anxiety-inducing, it's paralyzing. Why does this apply more to sexuality than specific partners? Firstly, like the choice to have particular partners. Firstly, sexuality is a more epistemic choice. It is fundamental to who you are. But secondly, it is fundamentally unknowable. Sexuality is a broad spectrum, and you will never know truly where you lie on that spectrum. So this proves the impact of internalized guilt, of uncertainty, of anxiety. That means people default to being straight. That means it is better if people view these things uncontrollable.
Good to go? Core question of this debate is, are people more accepting of traits that are out of your control or whether they're in your control? That when you're confronted with something that is weird, different, and maybe even off-putting, are you more likely to accept that difference when they're responsible for it or when they're not responsible for it? This is obviously the most important question in debate for about two discrete reasons. Firstly, it's more important than the entire gut bench's red herring material about shaming deviant or harmful sexuality, simply because that part of the debate is less likely to be changed, whereas this part of the debate is more likely to be a locus of change, for two reasons. Firstly, because quite obviously, harmful acts of sex are harmful, so people are likely to view them as bad because they are harmful. So when Prime Minister says, well, there's already a consensus that pedophilia is pretty bad because it harms kids, that's a good reason to believe that independent of this narrative, or the two narratives in this debate, people will take action against pedophiles. Second of all, if that is not true, and people will engage in harmful acts of sex, like for example what closing government describes when it comes to marital rape, you have to ask yourself, well, why are people so committing of that? The answer is because they are very strong and very powerful social structures that endorse that and say that it is okay. Which is to say that those institutions and the fact that they exist, institutions like the patriarchy, make it harder for our kind of narrative, or indeed any kind of narrative, to really provide much more of a meaningful resistance to it. So our narrative is one that's more likely to be successful. Now, the preemption that we get from Deputy Prime Minister is to say, well, no, people don't believe in, people are homophobic not for any good reason. They believe in it because some passage in Leviticus 12 in the Bible says that's bad. That's a pretty weak reason to hold on to a homophobic belief. The same passage that says that wearing mixed fabrics on a Sunday means you should get stoned, or that touching a pig skin makes you unclean, and yet people do not do those things. That's precisely our point. The narrative supporting homophobia is a quite weak narrative. It's a narrative that is weak precisely because being gay doesn't harm anybody, and that very obvious reason means that it's much more likely that we are able to topple this narrative with our counter-narrative. So that's why we are more likely to achieve change than the government bench. Now, that's why we are better than the government bench on their stronger material. We are also now better on opening opposition for independent reasons. That's to say that obviously, look, we're not going to hide it, we're both striving for the same impact. What Will does is he identifies the load-bearing premise for that argument. Crucially, it's a load-bearing premise for both their arguments, because both their argument about achieving external acceptance and also internal acceptance relies on people believing what kind of version of describing whether their traits is something they can or can't control is quite important to them, and that's what we'll explain. Now, the way they go about that is to explain that, well, our narrative is true, therefore our narrative will be believed. Now, that's not wrong. Obviously, the narrative is true, but just because a narrative is objectively true does not mean that people believe it to be true, and it doesn't mean that people are likely to view that to be very persuasive. So, to pick on them a little bit, I'm reluctant to do this, but just to illustrate my point, the idea that there exists gay zebras does not provide a lot of comfort to someone who is questioning their sexuality. That may exist, but doesn't make people feel okay with their sexuality. It's more likely that narratives that say, well, the fact that you were gay is something that you were born with, which means that it's something you should be proud of, to learn to live with, and to embrace because it is you. That is far more likely to be the way that people are convinced and assured of their own sexuality, which is precisely the narrative that we'll explain. That's why we're better. The second reason why we're better is because our specific identification of the distinction between mutable and immutable traits is more important when it comes to the ways in which we're able to legislate change against gay people, which is to say that legislations protect against immutable traits, like for example, the right to be free from racial discrimination, the right to be free from discrimination when you are disabled. So we're far more able to translate our social acceptance into legislative gains, which is the biggest margin of change. It's how we protect minorities by giving them rights and assurances that they will not be discriminated against under the law. That's why this question is obviously extremely important. So, having set the goalposts, let's score. What does urban government say here? They say that, the problem is the disgust towards queer people is exogenous to this debate, so it's not changed by either narrative. Now, opening opposition strategy is to try and contest this. The way we contest it is by saying, even if it is initially exogenous, it's useful to change the valence around that attitude by, for example, analogizing queer sexualities and other forms of sexuality to other kinds of things that people can control, but we say are very, very lacking. So, for example, it's useful for people to believe that queer love is the same thing as other kinds of love we can't control, like unconditional love, because that's the kind of love that we believe to be extremely important.
Well, secondly, it's just important to say that being queer is people expressing their authenticity, because we prize authenticity. Because in their world, like, yeah, someone might no longer choose to be queer, but if people are homophobic, you're just going to think that they're hiding their sexuality, that their choice is to hide and be deceitful to you. That is the problem with that narrative of choice. We have to say that that's not people hiding who they are, that's who they are, which means you have to embrace them at that point. That's why our narrative overcomes theirs. So, that's how we defeat opening government's material. I'll take opening.
All your examples of people liking uncontrollable things are when they're already good coded. Religions shame people for uncontrollable thoughts and intentions all the time. People don't like inherently annoying and loud people. Obviously, the unique thing in this debate is making people feel like they have the tools to do things that they have hoped, and pushing people to examine whether thoughts and actions actually worthy of shame in the first place.
To use your example, it's like people do not like liars. Yeah, because they fucking betray your trust all the time. People do not like violent people because they are violent. Being gay does not affect anybody. That is our point. So the fact that it is not inherently harmful means it's really easy to change the valence. But the way you change the valence is by analogizing the two things that we believe to be good. That argument does not work. Your preemptions just don't work. So that's opening government, and that's why we're able to win. Now let's rebut closing government. They offer 3 claims. The first is that this encourages sexual violence. This is basically the opening government material, but just applied to a less successful context. Because instead of going after pedophiles, which no one likes, they're trying to go after like sexist men who are the beneficiaries of the patriarchy. Good luck toppling that. And also all the responses that Will provides also similarly applies to this context. Their slightly better claims are like, well, it might be useful for people to reverse tradition to be queer in conservative context. You don't need a social narrative to tell people to be pragmatic. People will be pragmatic. That's not part of the debate. The last thing they say is, well, it's easier to experiment because you don't have to pre-commit to an identity. This gets it backwards because people don't pre-commit to identity and then experiment. People experiment first because they go to a party and hook up with someone and then reflect about what that means for them. And we think, if anything, it's easier when people have bad sex or they hook up with someone they don't like. It's easier for them to say, well, it's not because it's a choice that I made and won't be responsible for it. But instead, it just, I'm gay, that's what I do, I shouldn't be shamed for it. That's how you get people to experiment more freely. We'd be closing government more specifically. Proud to oppose.